No one remembered exactly who struck him first, only that by the time the shouting stopped, an Apache man lay twisted in the dirt behind the livery stable, with blood soaking through his buckskin and pooling beneath his ribs, his breath coming in shallow, wet gasps as if even the air was betraying him, and the men who had dragged him there stood in a loose half-circle, boots shifting, hands on belts, eyes darting not with guilt, but with calculation, as they measured how much trouble a dying Indian might cause them if he lived, while the town's wooden buildings loomed close, like silent witnesses that had seen too much and learned to say nothing. And someone muttered that he must have tried to steal a horse, even though no one could say which horse or how, only that it sounded reasonable enough to justify what they'd done. And as the Apache's dark eyes fluttered open, he tried to speak, but all that came out was a thin, broken sound, and one of the men stepped back as if afraid that sound alone might accuse him, saying low and fast that the man was already gone, and they shouldn't risk getting close, because a wounded Apache could still put a knife in you if you weren't careful. And that was when they decided, quietly and without a vote, to let him bleed out where he lay, because moving him meant responsibility, and responsibility meant consequences, and none of them wanted either. So they left him half in shadow, half in the weak afternoon light, like a problem set aside, while passers-by turned their faces away and pretended not to see the slow rise and fall of his chest, until a young woman carrying a bundle of cloth stopped at the edge of the alley, her eyes catching on the dark stain spreading beneath him. And for a moment she simply stood there, heart pounding, knowing by the way the men's shoulders tensed that she was not supposed to be here, not supposed to notice, not supposed to care. But she did, because he was not just an Apache or a thief or a nuisance. He was a man who was dying. And as she took a single step forward, one of the men warned her off with a sharp look and a shake of his head, telling her it wasn't her concern, that he had brought it on himself. Yet she saw the truth in the way his hands trembled and the way he refused to look back at the wounded figure, and without asking permission she knelt beside the Apache, pressing her cloth against the wound as warm blood soaked through. And when his eyes met hers, they were filled not with anger, but with a quiet, surprised gratitude, as if he could not believe that someone was touching him with anything but cruelty, and that small moment of human connection, so simple and so dangerous, would change everything by the next morning. The men backed away as if her kneeling beside him had broken some invisible rule, murmuring that she was foolish, that she didn't know what she was doing, that Apaches were dangerous even when they were half dead. But she ignored them, keeping her hand pressed hard against the gash in his side while feeling the weak flutter of his pulse beneath her fingers. And when she looked up, her eyes were steady, not brave in the way of someone seeking a fight, but firm in the way of someone who had already decided what was right, telling them he was bleeding to death and that if none of them would help, then she would. And the words hung there in the dusty air till one man spat on the ground and said she'd regret it. Yet still none of them stepped forward to stop her, because stopping her would mean admitting they were wrong. So she slid her arm under the Apache's shoulders and tried to lift him, gritting her teeth when his weight pulled against her, and though she was small and he was not, she managed inch by inch to drag him out of the alley toward the narrow street that led to her boarding house, the Apache groaning softly with every jolt but never pulling away, as if he understood that this woman was the only thing standing between him and the dark, and people watched from doorways and windows, some with curiosity, some with quiet disapproval, and more than a few with fear, because they had been content to believe that what happened behind the stable was none of their business. But now it was being carried right through the middle of town, and when she reached her door, her arms were shaking and her breath came in ragged pulls. Yet she did not let go until she had dragged him inside and laid him carefully on her narrow bed, tearing strips from her own apron to bind his wound, whispering to him that he had to stay awake, that he had to fight, because someone still cared whether he lived or died. And as the sun slipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor, a pair of dark figures stood far beyond the town's edge on a low ridge, watching through the wavering heat, already knowing that one of their own was hurt and that the woman who had saved him would soon change the fate of everyone who had chosen to walk away. Through the long night she stayed beside him, changing the blood-soaked cloth whenever it grew too heavy, pressing her hand to his chest to feel the faint rise and fall that told her he was still here, still fighting, even when fever made his skin burn beneath her touch and his lips moved in words she could not understand. And outside the thin walls of the boarding house, the town slept uneasily, unaware that something was already shifting. While inside, she whispered small, steady reassurances, as if her voice itself might anchor him to the world, telling him he was safe here, that no one would hurt him, even though she was not entirely sure it was true, because she had seen the looks on the men's faces, and she knew how quickly fear could turn into cruelty. Yet when he stirred near dawn and opened his eyes, they were clearer than before. Dark and focused, meeting hers with a calm that felt almost out of place in a body so badly broken. And he lifted his hand weakly as if to thank her, his fingers barely brushing her wrist before falling back. But the meaning was unmistakable, and it tightened something in her chest, making her realize that this was no longer just an act of charity, but a connection neither of them could step away from now. And as pale morning light crept through the small window, she noticed how the blood had slowed, how his breathing, though still ragged, was no longer slipping away from her. And for the first time, she allowed herself a thin breath of hope, even as she heard boots pass outside and voices murmuring, because she knew the town would not forget what she had done so easily. And she also knew that the men who had left him to die would not welcome the idea that he might live. And still, she did not move from his side, wiping the sweat from his brow, offering him water when he could swallow, watching every twitch of pain and every small sign of strength, as if her attention alone might keep him anchored to this world, while far beyond the last fence of the settlement, out where the land opened into dry hills and scattered juniper, a group of Apache warriors followed the trail of blood and broken brush that led toward the town, their faces hard and silent, reading the ground like a story that told them everything they needed to know. And though they did not yet know the name of the woman who had intervened, they already knew that one life spared would soon demand many answers. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty road, the fragile peace inside that small room grew thinner by the minute, because mercy, once given, had a way of calling the powerful back to account. By midday, the fever finally began to break, not all at once, but in small, fragile retreats, as if his body were slowly surrendering the fight against death. And she noticed it first when the tight heat beneath her palm eased and his breathing no longer rattled in his chest like loose stones in a tin. So she fetched more water and bathed his face, letting the coolness draw him back toward the present. And when his eyes opened again, they held a new awareness, searching the room, taking in the low ceiling, the plain wooden walls, the simple quilt she had pulled over him, and then settling on her with a quiet, steady look that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. And though neither of them spoke, something passed between them that did not need words, a shared understanding that this small, fragile space had become a kind of refuge, a place where the cruelty of the outside world could not quite reach, even if only for a little while. And she told him softly that he was safe here, that no one would come for him. Though even as she said it, she listened for every sound outside the door, because the town was never truly silent, and danger often announced itself with nothing more than a change in footsteps. And he nodded slightly, as if he understood both her promise and her fear. And later, when he was strong enough to drink broth from a spoon, he watched her with a gratitude that was almost painful, because he knew how rare it was for someone like him to be offered care instead of suspicion. And she, in turn, found herself wondering who he had been before the blood in the alley and the men who had walked away. What stories he carried beneath the wounds. And outside the boarding house, the town was already beginning to whisper, with people exchanging looks and murmured questions about the woman who had brought an Apache into her room, some of them curious, some of them angry, and more than a few afraid of what it might mean. And though none of them yet had the courage to knock on her door, their unease pressed against the walls like a gathering storm, while out beyond the fields and fences, the Apache warriors moved closer, their pace unhurried but relentless, guided by tracks and instinct, knowing that their brother was alive somewhere ahead, and that the people who had left him to die would soon have to answer for it. And inside that small room, with sunlight pooling softly across the floor, the woman sat beside the bed and held the dying man's hand, unaware that the safe haven she'd created was about to become the center of a reckoning far larger than either of them could imagine. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, A quiet rhythm settled over the room, broken only by the slow ticking of the small clock on the wall and the soft sound of his breathing. And she found herself moving with the careful familiarity of someone who had taken on a responsibility she no longer questioned, adjusting the blanket when he shivered, offering him sips of water when his lips grew dry, watching his face for any sign of pain. And though he still could not speak much, his eyes followed her with a steady awareness that told her he knew exactly what she was doing for him. And when their gazes met, there was a depth of understanding there that surprised her, because it was not gratitude alone but trust, something stronger and far more dangerous in a world that taught people like him to expect nothing but harm. And she felt it, too. Even though she barely knew him, because when someone lets you hold their life in your hands, even for a moment, it changes you. And she told him softly that she would not let them hurt him again, not the men who had left him to die, not anyone. And though he did not answer, a faint tightening of his fingers around hers felt like a promise. And outside, the town continued to buzz with uneasy energy, with people passing the boarding house more often than necessary, pretending to be busy while glancing at her window, wondering what kind of trouble she had brought down on herself. And some whispered that the Apache's people would come for him, that they would not come quietly, and fear spread faster than the truth ever could. Yet inside the small room there was only the slow, careful work of healing. And when dusk fell and the light turned amber, he finally managed to speak a few rough words in broken English, telling her his name and thanking her in a voice that was barely more than breath, and she repeated it softly, as if saying it might help anchor him here. And in that simple exchange, something solid took root between them, a bond forged not in grand gestures, but in quiet, stubborn care. While far beyond the edge of town, the Apache warriors were now close enough to see the roofs of the buildings, their silhouettes moving against the fading sky, carrying with them the weight of a debt that had yet to be paid. By the time darkness settled over the town, the uneasy glances had turned into something harder, and the men who had left the Apache to bleed were no longer content to simply wait and hope the problem would disappear, because rumors had a way of growing teeth, and now they were hearing that the Indian was still alive, that a woman had taken him in, that if his people found out there would be consequences none of them were prepared to face. So they gathered in low voices outside the saloon, telling themselves that they were only protecting the town, that they had to finish what they had started before it came back on them. And though some of them felt a flicker of doubt, it was quickly smothered by fear, because fear always demanded someone else pay for it. And when they finally started toward the boarding house, their boots sounded louder than they should have on the wooden walkways, as if the town itself were listening. And inside the small room, she felt the shift before she heard it, a tightening in the air that made her look up from the bed, her hand still resting on the Apache's shoulder as he slept. And when the first knock came, it was not gentle. It was the hard, impatient strike of men who believed they had the right to take whatever they wanted. And she moved to the door, her heart pounding, telling them through the wood that he was sick and needed to be left alone. But they answered with anger, saying he was a danger, that she was putting everyone at risk, and that she had no right to hide him. And as their voices rose, she saw his eyes open behind her, alert despite his weakness, understanding enough of the words to know what they meant. And for a moment she was afraid that he would try to get up, that he would try to face them himself. But she shook her head slightly, silently begging him to stay still, because this was one fight she intended to stand in front of, and she told the men that they had already done enough, that if they had any decency left, they would leave now. But decency was a luxury fear could not afford, and when the door handle began to turn, she felt the full weight of what she had chosen, that by saving one life she had placed herself in the path of many. And outside, unseen by the men pounding on her door, dark figures moved at the far edge of town, watching, waiting, and drawing closer with every heartbeat. The door had barely begun to creak open when the sound of a low, sharp call cut through the night, stopping the men in their tracks as if the air itself had turned solid, and from the far end of the street, dark shapes emerged, silent and steady, their movements too controlled to be anything but purposeful. And as the torchlight caught the glint of beadwork and rifle barrels, the truth became impossible to ignore, because the Apache warriors had arrived, not charging, not shouting, but walking forward with the kind of calm that came only from certainty. And the men who had been so eager moments before now found their courage slipping away, their hands tightening around their coats as they realized that what they had tried to bury in an alley had not stayed buried, and she stood frozen in her doorway, torn between fear and a strange sense of relief, because she knew in her heart that whatever happened next would be beyond her control, yet it would also be shaped by the choice she had made. And as the warriors closed the distance, one of them stepped forward, his eyes moving first to her and then past her to the wounded man on the bed. And though he did not speak, his meaning was clear. He was looking for his brother. And when she nodded and stepped aside to show him where the Apache lay, a ripple passed through the group outside, something like grief and something like gratitude mixed together, because they could see that he was alive, bandaged, breathing, and not abandoned after all. And the men from the town shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of how thin their justification sounded in the presence of those who had every right to demand answers. And one of the warriors finally spoke, his voice low and steady, asking who had done this, who had struck their brother and left him to die. And though no one answered at first, the silence itself was an accusation, because everyone knew who had been there, who had turned away, and who had decided that a life was not worth the trouble. And as the wounded Apache stirred and opened his eyes, recognizing the faces of his people, a faint smile touched his lips, and she saw the relief wash through him like a tide, because he was no longer alone, and outside the men who had come to finish what they started now found themselves standing on the wrong side of history, their fear no longer hidden. Because the next moments would not be decided by their anger, but by the truth they had tried to avoid. The street felt suddenly smaller as the Apache warriors spread out, not in a threatening rush, but in a quiet, deliberate way that made every man from the town feel seen. And the leader stepped forward again, his gaze steady as he looked from face to face, giving them every chance to speak before judgment fell. Yet none of them did, because there was no story they could tell that would make what they had done sound anything but cowardly. And when he finally spoke, his words were simple, asking why a wounded man had been left in the dirt behind the stable like an animal, and one of the townsmen tried to answer, stumbling over excuses about theft and danger, but his voice wavered and even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded, and she watched from the doorway as the truth began to press in on them. Because it was no longer just one woman standing up for what was right. It was a whole people demanding to know why one of their own had been treated as less than human. And when the wounded Apache found the strength to speak, he did so softly but clearly, telling them that he had not stolen anything, that he had only asked for water when he collapsed, and that the blow had come without warning. And those few words were enough to strip away the last of the lies, leaving only the raw fact of what had been done, and the warriors listened without interruption, their faces unreadable. Yet when he finished, there was a weight in the air that made every breath feel heavier, and the leader turned to the men who had struck him, telling them that mercy had been shown by a woman they had tried to silence, and that it was now their turn to answer for their cruelty. And though no blood was drawn, the shame in that moment cut deeper than any knife, because they were forced to stand there and be seen for what they were, not protectors of the town, but men who had chosen convenience over compassion. And as the Apache warriors took their brother back into their care, lifting him gently, she felt a quiet pride rise in her chest, knowing that her choice had not only saved a life, but had exposed a wrong that could no longer hide. And as the group began to withdraw, leaving the stunned town behind, a fragile sense of justice settled over the street. Because sometimes the most powerful reckoning came not from violence, but from being forced to face the truth. Morning came with a strange stillness, as if the town itself were holding its breath, and when the Apache warriors returned, they did so not in anger, but with purpose, carrying their wounded brother now steadier on a litter, his color stronger, his eyes clear, and the men who had wronged him were called out from their homes one by one, forced to step into the open where the truth could no longer be hidden behind closed doors or whispered excuses. And the leader spoke plainly, reminding everyone that mercy had been given where cruelty had been chosen, and that debts of honor did not fade just because the sun had risen on a new day. And though the townsmen trembled, expecting violence, none came, because the justice the Apaches brought was not the kind that spilled blood. It was the kind that stripped away lies and demanded responsibility. and they required the men to return what they had taken from others, to compensate the woman for the risk she had been forced to bear, and to stand publicly in front of the town and acknowledge what they had done, and one by one they did. Their voices quiet, their eyes downcast, admitting that they had struck a wounded man and left him to die. And those words, spoken aloud, changed how the town saw them, because cruelty could survive in shadow but not in daylight. And as the Apache warriors watched, they made no sound, letting the weight of confession do its work. And when it was done, the leader turned to the woman, thanking her for her courage, telling her that her mercy had saved not just one life but the honor of many. And she felt a warmth spread through her chest, because she had not acted for reward. Yet it mattered that someone saw what she had done, and as the warriors prepared to leave with their brother, now safe to travel, the town stood quietly, chastened and changed, knowing that they had witnessed something rare, a moment when injustice had been answered not with more cruelty but with truth. And as the dust settled on the road behind the departing Apaches, a sense of rightness lingered, fragile but real, because sometimes redemption came not from forgetting what was done, but from facing it and choosing to do better. The town felt different after they were gone, not louder or quieter, but lighter, as if something heavy had finally been set down, and the woman noticed it in small ways, in how people met her eyes instead of turning away, in how the same men who had once muttered and judged now walked with a little less certainty in their steps. And though nothing about the buildings or the dusty street had changed, something inside the people who lived there had, because they had seen what happens when one act of mercy is allowed to stand against a crowd. And she returned to her room and found it strangely empty without the Apache man's presence, his bed neatly made, his bandages gone. Yet his absence did not feel like a loss. It felt like a story completed, because he had left alive and honored, and that was all she had ever wanted for him. And as she folded the quilt he had slept under, she found a small bead he must have dropped, simple and dark, and she held it in her palm for a moment, smiling softly, before placing it on the windowsill as a quiet reminder that courage often left behind small, unexpected traces. And outside life slowly resumed its ordinary rhythms, with wagons rolling through and children playing. Yet there was a gentleness in the air that had not been there before, as if the town itself were learning. And though no one spoke of it openly, everyone knew that the woman had changed something important, not by force or anger, but by refusing to let a dying man be treated as nothing. And as days passed, she carried that lesson with her, understanding now that even in a place that could be cruel, there was room for compassion to take root, and that one person, standing quietly and firmly, could shift the direction of many and far beyond the town, somewhere on the wide open land. An Apache warrior who had once been left for dead was riding again, carrying with him the memory of a woman who had chosen mercy when it was not easy, and that memory would travel with him like a blessing, because stories of kindness had a way of spreading farther than stories of violence ever could, and in that knowledge there was peace, the kind that did not erase the past but made it worth having endured. Somewhere between fear and courage, a single choice can change the shape of the world, and in a place where cruelty once decided who deserved to live, one woman proved that mercy still had power, reminding us that redemption is never about being perfect. It is about being willing to stand when it matters most. Until the next story, this is Redemption West, where broken lives find their way back into the light.